You're listening to an interview taken from the Tonic Talk Show and Podcast, heard exclusively on Zoomer Radio. To download or listen to the original episode or other episodes of The Tonic, please visit thetonic.ca.
Dr. Jon Cowan has been studying happiness and unhappiness for over 40 years, starting with his PhD research at the University of California, San Francisco, and continuing with studies performed at the National Institute on Drug Abuse Addiction Research Center, combining neuroscience and psychology. His exploration of brainwave biofeedback, mentored by its discoverer, and seasoned by clinical practice, culminated in the development of 3 new methods of training for focus, alertness, and Eureka. Eureka is a way of measuring the brain's response to new learning and improving it, while also enhancing the positive feelings, including happiness and joy, which are created to motivate you to keep learning. He has developed several biofeedback training products that combine these methods to improve performance and emotion. Welcome to the show, Doctor. How are you?
Oh, I'm fine today. I've been looking forward to this virtual meeting.
Yeah, me as well. So it may be obvious to some out there, but do you think North Americans, the Americans like you and the Canadians like us, are a lot less happy than we were a year ago?
Well, I think that's clearly true. This is a very unhappy time, and people are doing a wide variety of unsafe things, I believe, to try to regain contact with their external sources of happiness. For example, there are a number of sources of excited happiness, like sporting events, where the emotions are really moments that many people are living for, and they miss them terribly. That's why we see people out in crowds exposing themselves to COVID and spreading it. Wearing masks is uncomfortable and makes us unhappy until we get used to it.
Yeah, I agree. What we're seeing here is, people are going out to bars and congregating together. And you're right. I mean, it's a dangerous practice. What I find, it's not just the direct, health risks of COVID, but it's the spin-off effects. It's the stress and anxiety that really seem to be taking hold of this pandemic. But your focus is a little different. You have a phrase, a happiness deficit. What does that mean, and how do you feel that fits in?
Well, I think you can actually, measure the amount of happiness that people have, and people in the field have done studies of, the most happy nation in the world, for example. And if we looked at our gross levels of happiness now and compared them to a year ago, I think we really have a much lower average level of deficit. I think we pay a lot less overt attention to our unhappiness than we do to anxiety and stress. Relatively little has really been written about it, yet everybody talks about their anxiety and stress. But happiness is considered to be one of the most important goals in life by the Dalai Lama, other sages like Satchidananda. And the pursuit of happiness is, of course, enshrined in the American Declaration of Independence.
Right.
So it's a very important component of our lives that has been really denigrated by this epidemic.
I want to try and wrap my head around, what's the difference between happiness or a lack of stress or anxiety? How does that manifest differently?
Well, I think happiness is actually that moment when you really feel good. You don't have to feel good just because you're not in a moment of stress.
Fair enough.
Feel flat, normal. There's a place for normality. And by the way, I think happiness is different than depression.
Right.
The emotion of depression. And they affect different neurotransmitter systems, for example. We have another approach to depression, which we're not really going to focus on today, but it works in a slightly different manner to affect different brain systems.
Why do you think that we don't focus enough on happiness and you seem to be talking more about anxiety and stress? Why is that?
Well, I think it's not as acceptable as an excuse for behavior. I think that it's not linked to a medical condition. Anxiety and stress are things that people can kind of excuse far more easily. But we know that we have a little bit more control over our happiness, but we don't exercise it. By the way, I think happiness and unhappiness actually is clearly linked to addiction. That's what we started to find back in the 70s at the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And people use drugs or alcohol to feel good. The connection is really through decreased activity of the brain's dopamine reward system. And it's really in our fundamental brain biology not just on the circumstances of our lives.
Right.
The positive psychologists have basically written off 50% of the source of happiness as unknown or genetic, or in some cases they reach as far as saying it's biological. But the difference between biological and genetic is really huge, because biological can be modified, whereas something that's really basically genetic and not susceptible to epigenetic changes can't be modified.
So are we losing focus on what the source of happiness is?
I think we are. There is a major source of happiness within ourselves, and we do not seem to have taught people how to enhance it. This dopamine system in the brain is something that can be modified, and we've found out how to do that. And we can, I think, learn to increase our average level of happiness over time and to experience moments of calm or excited happiness at times when we want to.
All right. Well, that's very intriguing. How do we do that? How do we regain our happiness levels?
Well, we do this with a particular type of brain happiness exercise, which really takes advantage of the neuroplasticity of the brain, and particularly the dopamine system. I've discovered a brainwave that's associated with happiness and other positive feelings. Actually, this is something that's been known for a long time, but it was thought to be involved primarily with learning new material. It's a particular type of gamma brainwave, which goes up and down at 40 cycles a second, and we have a unique method to separate its effects from others. This brainwave also seems to trigger the reward system, because the idea is once you learn something new, the brain is set up to encourage you to go out and do it again, learn something more. It's good for your survival. So my research collaborator, Dr. Sakadze, has actually shown in a published study that we can train people with it and increase their happiness level for 4 months or more in just 12 sessions done once a week. We call this brainwave Neureka because it is involved in the process of discovery and new learning. And it turns out that training to increase it also improves attention and memory and seems to be very helpful with autistic issues. So it's now available in this simple neurofeedback system, the Happi Trainer, Happi, with dry electrodes, which also has feedback to improve your focus. Essentially, you watch a happy DVD or video, and the picture gets bigger as you feel better. So you quickly learn how to increase it.
And so what's the converse then? If you don't learn to be happy, what happens?
Well, what happens is that your emotions are more or less out of control, and there is not too much you can do but to be susceptible to the emotions of the moment.
Okay.
You might not necessarily, things that are triggered by your actual experiences at the time. You may not necessarily get unhappy,
Right.
but there is a greater possibility that you will. Basically, what you want to do is tilt the odds here. You want to increase the percentage of time that you are happy, and we'll talk about why in a moment, I'm sure.
Well, okay. Well, but why? I mean, I'm a glass half empty guy. I don't tend to be happy. I think if somebody saw me, I can be happy. I can laugh and I can enjoy, but it's not my natural state. So would somebody like me, would I be able to become happier through practice?
Yes, you would. And, of course, the first thing that you need to do is to pay attention to what your happiness levels are. And most of us don't really pay attention to our levels from moment to moment. That's what this system allows you to do. And then it gives you a simple way to be able to increase your happiness level, your Neureka output, and to hold it for at least a short period of time, which then grows as you practice further.
So other than obviously being happy, what are the spin-off benefits of being happy? What does it lead to?
There are huge benefits here, actually, because we know from a very complete research literature that happiness improves our long-term health, and happy people tend to be more successful in a number of ways. Also, several studies that are specifically done about immunity to viruses have been summarized in a Psychology Today blog, and basically they indicate that the happier you are, the less likely you are to even get a cold. So it seems that we have a way to actually modify our susceptibility to the ravages of even something like COVID.
Right.
Now, back in about 2015 or so, when we had a very good Surgeon General here in the U.S., he actually came out with an article basically saying we may be missing the most important sources of our health by not paying attention to happiness. And actually, this was an article summarized from some of his TEDx talks, which are still available.
So the takeaway point then I would say is we should focus on our happiness and make it part of our daily practice, yes?
Yes, and if we have trouble with it, there are ways to actually use technology to boost our sensitivity to it and to make our practice more regular. And then we can put this into our daily lives. Once we have that ability to essentially change to a happy state on a moment's intent, then we can essentially put this into our daily lives as a practice that we do whenever we remember. And this is not like a meditation practice in the sense that we're not setting aside a specific part of the day for it and then doing something else otherwise. We're trying to integrate this into our moment-to-moment interactions in the world. And I do think, though, that it could be combined with some meditation. So basically, I think we can use technology to learn to be happier, and we can integrate that happiness into our daily lives through a practice we call Happitation.
Thank you so much for coming